Hello everyone, it's Susie again from Esoteric Trading Solutions. I hope you're all well, looking after yourself, being kind to your family and your friends, being kind to yourself, being kind to your beautiful animals, your beautiful putty cats, beautiful dogs, and just being kind to people in the world generally to make this a better place. I know it's really bad, this whole coronavirus and everything, but and it's making people very scared, but it's just horrible when I do hear things about racism against Asian people. I'm very against racism of any kind, and honestly, racism leads to concentration camps, as we saw with the Jewish people in Nazi Germany. So it's not a great story when you hear about racism. But anyway, something came across my desk from Politico, which is basically Spanish flu lessons from the 1918, and I thought I'd just do a YouTube on this because I think it's very interesting to always look at history. And this one is by Politico, as I said, and it's rampant lies, fake cures and not enough beds, what the Spanish flu debacle can teach us about the coronavirus. And obviously history does have a way of repeating itself, and this is a fascinating photograph when you look at this. I love looking at old historical photographs. I find them fascinating just from the point of view of what people wear, you know, what things used to look like, just all sorts of things. I just find it really, really interesting to look at history particularly. And this was an emergency hospital during the influenza epidemic, Cape Funston, Kansas, approximately 1918, which is over 100 years ago. Pretty incredible to think all these people are dead now. Amazing. And, you know, they're all wearing masks just like we are today. Well, I'm not, but a lot of other people are. But in March 1918, the US states fully mobilized for World War I, and soldiers at Camp Funston in Fort Riley, Kansas, began reporting acute flu-like symptoms, including aches, respiratory distress, chills, coughing, and high fever. Just to add to that, apparently doctors out there are saying take vitamin D. So I'm taking a lot of vitamin D because apparently it's really good for respiratory, any sort of respiratory, whether you have asthma or phlegm or whatever it might be. So I'm taking that. But anyway, just a month later, over 1,100 men had come down with the disease. 46 of them, roughly 4%, had died. It was the start of the infamous Spanish flu. Now, apparently it didn't come from Spain. It's a misnomer for the scourge that likely began in the US, but as troops found out across Europe, claimed 21 million lives globally, including 600,000 Americans. I mean, that's a massive figure, seriously. I don't know what the population of the world was in 1918, but 21 million is outstanding. And to think that, there was a death rate about 4% or more is huge. What began in army camps where 25% of the soldiers developed the flu spread by the fall to the civilian population. I don't know what the fall means in American terminology. I don't know whether that's your autumn or whatever. But in Boston, 2,002 people died on just one day, October the 1st. Philadelphia later topped that record with 700 deaths in one 24-hour period. Wow. The disease wasn't discriminatory. It devastated urban populations like Pittsburgh, New York City, but also almost hit vulnerable rural areas like Arkansas, where the public health infrastructure was essentially non-existent. Wow, it's amazing. 1918-1919 influenza pandemic stands as a lasting reminder of what happened when governments and their citizens failed to meet a crisis head-on. So basically the government, there was a lack of leadership from Washington. It was at the time of Woodrow Wilson, and presidents didn't, come to the public and talk about pandemics or anything else. The state governments basically didn't think it was important. Public officials either lied or made up facts or didn't really tell the media. There was a lack of proper public health infrastructure that was inadequate to handle, this horrible epidemic. And ordinary citizens also refused to heed the warnings of experts, which is really interesting. So basically, there was a lot that was going wrong at that time to actually contain this virus. And interestingly enough, this article does say that, even though medicine and public health weren't as good as they are now, they were still reasonably good because they'd, cured diseases like cholera, typhoid, and diphtheria. to a manageable or even preventable level. So amazing. American cities and its military had extensive experience with quarantines and other social measures to stop vectors of transmission, and yet the governments were bungling, and a general lack of preparedness helped the pandemic spread like wildfire. Well, at least globally and everywhere else, people are actually, doing what they need to do by closing down lots of areas where people have to meet. Even in Australia, we're not allowed to have too many people meeting. Measures being taken. The schools are still open, but of course they're monitoring it very, very, very quickly. But I know in parts of Europe they've closed down everything, particularly in Amsterdam, they've closed down everything, literally. Professional historians usually call the old adage that history is bound to repeat itself, and certainly it does. So what went wrong in 1918? Well, they talk about Philadelphia, which was where the local government completely failed to meet the public health crisis. They didn't tell the people, and the root of the problem was there was 300 sailors who went, they were all infected, and they docked in the Navy Yard. And then Boston had already been hard hit by the epidemics. The city officials were well aware of its deadly potential. The city, whose infrastructure had buckled even before the war, was now teeming with new workers and migrants who stretched the housing stock, streets and transportation to capacity. It took about 10 days before over 600 servicemen and civilians were sick enough to require hospitalisation, including several doctors and nurses who had been treating the sick patients. And that's what we found in Wuhan originally. Apparently they knew about the virus in Wuhan in China in November, or the end of November, the 1st December. And the fellow that noticed the virus, the first, the Chinese doctor, he ended up dying from it because he was so overly exposed to it. And that seems to be what happened. Even President Trump didn't really think it was that serious until probably the last week or so. But thank God that's all changed, and people globally are taking this virus very, very seriously. Philadelphia's Director of Public Health and Charities, a political appointment, Dr. Wilma Cruz, a gynecologist who lacked training in epidemiology, basically downplayed the severity of the threat and not doing anything and not telling people and not even getting doctors to be concerned about it. So he basically insisted there was nothing to worry about. He just said it was just an old-fashioned influenza or gripe. And he said from now on the disease will decrease. But the thing is, what happened is the disease kept rising and rising and rising, which is pretty amazing. And the thing is, they didn't actually tell people, how bad it was. So within 10 days, over 1,000 Philadelphians lay dead, with another 200,000 estimated ill. And the state government in Harrisburg ordered the city's public amusements and gathering places closed down, a ban that shut saloons, theatres, ice cream parlours and movie theatres. But it was all too little too late. We have seen in most of the world that all these are being shut down. As the body count continued to climb, the Catholic archbishops assigned 3,000 nurses and seminarians to make shift hospitals and dig mass graves. Golly, imagine that. By March 1990, with the threat of influenza lifted, Philadelphia had lost over 15,000 of its citizens. I don't know how many people would have been in Philadelphia at the time, but 15,000 is a lot. Local officials ignored the whole thing of action and basically failed to line up medical professionals or doctors or anything, and there was just so many people dying of this, and there was a number of reasons why. Apparently Pittsburgh was a very poor area. It had a lot of working class people. It was very industrial, very dirty. They didn't have a lot of hospital infrastructures, and a lot of things hadn't been closed down like in other areas. So, also the people that were working in the working class, were very poor in their health and their hygiene. So it basically made it even worse and worse from that perspective. And that's why it got so bad in Pittsburgh and was spread out to other parts of the country as well. But it didn't help that local officials and even the government didn't say anything about the risk of this shocking disease. So it just went absolutely feral, and it caught people off guard, that's for sure. So the body count was rising, and people just dismissed things. I mean, even this Colonel Philip Doan, who led health and safety at the military shipyards where the disease first spread, dismissed the so-called Spanish influenza as nothing more or less than an old-fashioned gripe. President Woodrow Wilson basically didn't say anything, and a lot of other people didn't say anything either. So very, very disappointing, and obviously the Americans were ill prepared to confront a pandemic. The state of the country's healthcare system was primitive by modern standards. In Pittsburgh, a city teeming with factories and industrial workers, the poor quality of air contributed to widespread, devastating respiratory problems. So basically, even before the influenza, the rate of pneumonia was really high, 253 deaths per 100,000. Wow, that's huge, which outstripped even cities except New York. So, health workers lived in terrible, terrible conditions by the sounds of it, soot and ash from factories and the like, and housing stock was also poor, and they were mostly working class residents. So, wow, that's just amazing when you look at the history here. Rural America was hardly better equipped to weather the storm than big cities, okay? So there was a lot of poverty in the South, and people were poorly nourished, afflicted with common parasites and diseases. So, it really, really did take hold in parts of America, and it's no wonder that so many people died of the Spanish flu. So, and then there was other people, it's one Dr. Franklin Dwayne gave interviews and ran advertisements for a fake home remedy, arguing that the more you fear disease, the more sure you're going to get it. And then he was trying to sell things like mandrake pills, beechin pills, antiseptic snake oil to protect you from the relief of flu, or vapor rub and this sort of business. So there was a lot of Houdinis out there saying use this and you'll get rid of the germs and all this sort of stuff. So people seem to be very gullible. I don't think people these days are very gullible, particularly with all the internet and all the social media and everything else. But it just shows you that when governments don't take things seriously and they don't tell people quickly, these things can just get so out of control. And obviously, subsequently, it left to 21 million people dying, which is a lot. So what we can learn by this is certainly the White House and the federal administration didn't seem to take it very important initially, but certainly now they are. They're putting $1 trillion into the financial markets every day through repo, and that's going to last for the next 4 weeks. President Donald Trump's even said to people they can pay their taxes later. I think the American tax payments are due on April the 15th. He's given people another 90 days to pay their tax. And, there's other relief. They're going to be giving people $1,000 to spend or to help with their bills if they're not working and those sort of things. So they're doing a lot more, obviously, in the world today, thank God, than what they did in 1918. But certainly from this article, we can learn from this article. There's no doubt about it. Obviously the best thing to do when we have things like this. But also, even in Australia, Prime Minister Scott Morrison said to people, stop hoarding food, because you go to, like anywhere else in the world, you go to, I went to Woolworths today, large grocery, shop where everyone goes, or Coles in Australia, and there's just no food on the shelves. There's no anything, toilet paper, no food, no hardly any bread. You can't even find toothpaste. I couldn't buy any soap. And he's basically stood up today and said, stop hoarding, Australians, and stop buying everything off the shelves. It's un-Australian-like. Share with everyone. Things will get replenished. It's not the end of the world sort of thing. And I think people have just taken this a bit too far. I know people are frightened, but it is, I think, taken a bit way too far, to be honest. And also, this racism against Chinese and Asian people, it's terrible. I mean, I haven't seen it myself particularly being back in Australia, but if I saw it, I would certainly have a go at the person that's being racist. I mean, we have race vilification laws here, so if you were racist at someone, you can actually be charged for it by the police. And, as I said before, racism leads to concentration camps. Not a great story, and I don't believe in it. This is one of these things that's happened, and we have to deal with it, as a world, basically, and try to be the best we can with it. But I found this article really interesting, and I think we can learn a lot from history and what not to do. And, I think very, very interesting. I'm not sure why Italy is, Italy's about 32,000 now with about 2,500 deaths. I mean, clearly it is older people, and I do think Italy has a problem with social infrastructure in terms of hospitals potentially, but also, the Italians are very, warm and very huggy, and maybe that's contributing to it as well. But, I hope it gets better over there, that's for sure. But I think that's all, pretty much. Let's quickly look at here. See anything else that's going on here, but let's hope things start to settle down a bit, and people are just nice to each other. So please be nice to everyone. Look after yourselves, look after your family, your friends, look after all your beautiful animals, your putty cats. And I know there's a lot going on, but please make this a better world. Just, the old-fashioned world was a nicer world where everyone was nice to each other, and that's the world I want to live in, guys. I don't want to live in a horrible world where people hate each other and are racist, that's for sure. Anyway, guys, please look after yourself, and thank you very much for listening. It's Susie, and I'll talk to you very soon. Thank you.